Okay, well, I think we will begin. Hello, everybody. I am Matthew Bishop. I'm sitting in a room just outside New York, and Tim, you're in a room in Seattle, I'm guessing.
That's right.
So we're coming towards the end of what's been a very inspiring 2 days of catalyzing change events, and we are a sort of experiment in a virtual fireside chat. The aim is very much to have a conversation between myself and Tim, and to involve as many of you as would like to come in through the question function on the chat board as well. I'm gonna start by posing a few questions to Tim, and then he's going to pose a few questions back to me, and then we'll see where we go from there. And our theme is obviously related to this agenda of catalyzing change around how do we take this awful moment of COVID and drive really transformational systems change out of it, so that when we go forward from here and finally do move out of the crisis, we're on a better path, and hopefully a path towards the SDGs, a path that we really weren't on very clearly before we went into this crisis. And we want to talk more broadly also about the role of donors and philanthropy in getting onto that better path, and whether really this is a moment where philanthropy, which I think has probably talked more about systems change than it's really invested in it, whether that's going to change. So Tim, I wanted to just, I think many people on this call will have known you from your many years at Landesa, but maybe you give a little bit about yourself and how you've changed from being a sort of poacher to gamekeeper in a way, and if that's the right word, from going from being a social entrepreneur to being on the donor side, and really what the mission of the Chandler Foundation is.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Matthew. And it's an honor to be here and see so many friends and colleagues on the call. So you asked how I got here. I'll start maybe with my childhood, but don't worry, I won't go into too long of a story. But it did shape me. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest in a farming community, a family of 11 people living under the poverty line, and I grew to know both the challenges and the rewards of manual labor. And growing up, I worked alongside migrant families and saw their hardships, saw the inequities that limited their opportunities in life. And those experiences really deeply influenced me. So they led me to the work I did in helping to co-found and lead Landesa over the years. I think it helped shape Landesa's approach that really aims to change systems, in this case, land rights systems, to help provide opportunity for social and economic mobility ladders for all people, but particularly for marginalized populations. And also that experience with Landesa taught me the importance of law, of policy, of the rule of law, of good governance, of good government, and how those impact opportunities for upward social and economic mobility. And those views have naturally extended to my work at the Chandler Foundation, where I have the privilege of working with a donor, Richard Chandler, whose very different experience had led him to some of the same conclusions. So his experiences as an emerging market investor and as a builder of businesses and social enterprises in emerging markets, and also as a longtime philanthropist who started his philanthropy, as most philanthropists do, and supporting direct service delivery in kind of small scale ways, addressing what I would say the symptoms of poverty, and over the years came to start thinking about what can my philanthropy and philanthropy more broadly do to address causes, and how can it change enabling conditions or change the systems that seem broken or need building up. So that's a little bit my journey. You asked about the Chandler Foundation. I'd be happy to get into that a bit, because our North Star is about helping to build and broaden prosperity in emerging economies. We have a core belief that while talent is distributed broadly, opportunity is not. And our approach around systems change is led by several or informed by several observations. So first, in terms of resources and leverage, governments and businesses, the business sector, play a much larger role than NGOs or philanthropy in building and broadening prosperity. Second, that social change actors in philanthropy have a really important role to play, but I think have not performed up to their potential for catalyzing, for leveraging, for pushing these much bigger players. And third, that so much philanthropy is aimed at alleviating symptoms of government failure or business failure, and takes the form of supporting smaller scale direct service delivery to those who are failed by these ineffective and unjust systems. So our approach is to work in partnership with others to support efforts that are trying to change systems, and particularly those that are helping to build the enabling conditions in which prosperity can grow and broaden. At the moment, we're particularly focused on issues relating to good governance, as well as the building blocks for a vibrant and fair business sector.
And what would be a couple of sort of signature investments that you've made?
Well, so our investments are both within a larger donor collaborative in co-impact, and then our individual ones. So some of our more recent individual ones and kind of new ones around governance are with open contracting partnerships, which deals with trying to build better governance and accountability around government procurement systems around the world. You know, so much of government resources are through procurement systems, and there's obviously a lot of waste, fraud, abuse, ineffectiveness in those systems. And also open government partnerships, which is really a platform that allows governments and civil society, and now increasingly the business sector, to come along and push for reforms around transparency and accountability.
Now, obviously, I mean, you've known Giroux quite a few years, as have I. And I'd be interested to know if there's any how you first met her and so forth, but also how beyond obviously a great enthusiasm for anything Giroux does. What's drawn you to this Catalyzing Change, Catalyst 2030 coalition?
Yeah, well, Giroux's fabulous, and we've known each other for a while and got to meet each other through these social entrepreneur communities, and we got also to spend time together at a week-long course at Harvard around systems change entrepreneurship.
Which is almost a contradiction in terms, isn't it, that you could go to Harvard and learn about systems change. But,
well, that's another story altogether, which Giroux also could tell you. But there was a bit of a revolt early in the week from the social entrepreneurs against Harvard and the faculty that was teaching it. But and Harvard, to their credit, actually pivoted quite nicely. But what drew, I think, Chandler Foundation to Catalyst 2030 is, first of all, the recognition that addressing the world's large, complex problems is going to require changing the way the social change sector, and including the donor side of that sector, is operated. I mean, I saw in my 3+ decades of being a doer, being a social entrepreneur, that not enough donors were embracing a systems mindset. Not enough donors were taking kind of a long-term perspective. Not enough were working in kind of trust-filled partnerships with their grantees, and providing funding in a manner that really was structured to better support systems change. Also, my experience as a social entrepreneur and having the privilege to be part of broader social entrepreneur communities, and particularly in my case, a school community and club community, led me to see the power and the potential of social entrepreneurs to address some of the world's biggest, most complex problems. And I was constantly amazed and inspired these leaders and these organizations, what they were accomplishing. But it led me to think about what more could be done, particularly if there was better coordination, collaboration, among the communities, but between those on the doer side and the donor side, better engagement with governments and business. And I think, as I saw it, Catalyst 2030 was launched to trigger those types of transformations. I mean, to coordinate action, to facilitate systems change, to optimize funding for that systems change. So I was just attracted to that and saw the power and potential of it. And particularly at a moment where I saw unprecedented collaboration amongst the kind of big social entrepreneur ecosystem players, Skoll, Schwab, Ashoka, Echoing Green, all coming together behind this movement. So that's what led Chandler Foundation and me to it. I'm excited about the power and potential, but I do think it needs more donors. It needs more donors to get involved.
And now you've moved from one side to the other. I mean, do you have what's your explanation as to why donors have not really done such a good job on this systems change work over the years? Is there something about the ecosystem they're operating in that makes it hard, or have they just not thought enough about it, or what?
It's probably some combination of that, Matthew. I mean, I'm embracing a systems mindset and supporting system change. First of all, requires a longer term view. It requires an ability to not always be able to connect the dots between your support and the contribution, because it requires a coalition of actors. So I think the long-term nature, I think that the difficulties around contribution and attribution, this is maybe a bit controversial, but I also think that sometimes sometimes program officers within well-staffed foundations don't necessarily see it as in their interest either, because it may not be consistent with they can't show their value addition maybe as well. But yeah, I think there's a variety of reasons why there hasn't been enough. But it's maybe easy to point the fingers at what the donors aren't doing well enough. But I think a lot of doers also haven't embraced a systems mindset and systems change. So I think I see movement in the right direction, but it needs much more.
I mean, was there a thing that you said to yourself as a social entrepreneur, if I ever was in charge of a foundation, this is the first thing I would do differently? And did you do that?
Yeah, so first of all, even as a leader of a foundation, and this is going to sound like an excuse, but what you're doing is to try to achieve the donor intent in the best way that you can, and you're trying to add value to that. But at the end of the day, it is about donor intent, and one has to. So it's not as if any foundation leader or any single foundation board member has the ability to change it. There are other stakeholders, but in terms of answering your question, I think it's about taking a longer term approach and about collaborating and not worrying so much about being able to track exactly what your contribution is and what it led to. That is, if you're doing something simple, well, relatively simple and short term, that has a product or a service that you can, after a year or 2 years, say, look, this is the outcome. We achieved that. I can point to it. I can look at the people and talk to the people directly that I know that we made a difference for. There is a real amount of satisfaction in that. And I think supporting systems change doesn't give those same opportunities.
So, I think we've both been talking a lot about this moment that we're in and how COVID-19 changes, the trajectory that we've all been on. Even, Catalyst 2030, very quickly, as we're now pivoting to the COVID crisis, and the SDGs. This was supposed to be the big year of delivery, starting the decade of delivery for the SDGs, and in a way we've gone off in a totally different and arguably more short-term orientated direction. I think one of the big challenges is, how do we make sure this isn't just a sort of a lot of resources get put into short-term symptom addressing that isn't really laying the groundwork for the kind of society that we envisaged with the SDGs. But how do you see that?
Yeah, no, I think that was well put in terms of the question. It's a great question. So I'm not a disaster response expert, but I know that in that field they often talk in terms of relief, recovery, and resilience. And I think the Chandler Foundation's response, it's based on both our expertise, but also our strategy and approach, has focused more on the resilience and than the relief end. Now, on the relief side, we have made several commitments to existing program partners around acute challenges that have been presented by the crisis, challenges and opportunities. So we've doubled down with some additional funding to existing program partners. We've also tried to change even more in the direction of being flexible and program partner centric. And while most of our giving already was unrestricted and our reporting mechanisms were pretty flexible, we've provided even greater flexibility to our program partners in terms of spending, in terms of reporting, in terms of metrics and milestones achievement. We also joined commitments made by other donors, such as the London Funders Network, Council of Foundations, around these things. So it is true that the pandemic has caused devastating consequences, health consequences, economic consequences, that there are urgent needs around those, and those need to be addressed. And it's great to see other donors really stepping up to address some of those acute needs. We applaud those donors, but our approach, I think, both within the Chandler Foundation and Co-Impact, is primarily thinking about what is the system's response to COVID-19, and we're trying to respond accordingly. So asking questions about how can we shore up. The other thing about the pandemic is it has exposed weaknesses and shortcomings in many of the existing systems. So we're asking the questions about how can we shore up those systems, both now, but even maybe more importantly for the long term. And how can we focus on that long-term resilience phase? So just to give you some examples, for Co-Impact, that's meant doubling down with some existing program partners like Last Mile Health and the Liberian Ministry of Health to train and equip a countrywide network of community health workers, with Project ECHO, which is a simple but a very powerful model of moving specialized medical knowledge from academic centers to frontline health workers. Yeah, but I think about the broader systems, both challenges and opportunities, because I think it does present opportunities for us to be thinking in new ways about what is possible around structural reform. It also, I think, has changed the government or the public's appetite for what is possible. So in policy reform circles, there's a thing called the Overton window, the Overton window is kind of the range of public policies that the mainstream population is prepared to consider. That Overton window has shifted and will shift. So what are the opportunities that we have as philanthropists in the social change sectors to take advantage of that shift? For example, in the United States, and our funding isn't focused in the United States, but things are like universal health care, like universal basic income. These are just examples of, I think, the Overton window shifting, and maybe shifting already and likely to shift more. And how can we be best poised to take advantage?
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, if I look back at the 2008 financial crisis and some of the efforts to rebuild after that, I mean, there was a sense that I felt that if only Obama had filled the room with a bunch of social entrepreneurs, we'd have had a much better response coming out of the crisis. I mean, I'm not sure that would have been, I mean, I think there's some questions about whether I was right in thinking that, because obviously the kind of capacity to deal with billions of dollars, is not necessarily always there in the social entrepreneur world. But I do think there was a sense in which, by the time we really got people, the people who are really on the ground, who can see the different way of doing things, by the time they got their act together to put the new ideas forward, that Overton window had probably closed and been filled with a lot of rather ineffective, traditionally same old solutions. And my worry is the same might happen here, although I think probably this is going to be a longer crisis than the financial crisis, at least in terms of its, there'll be a whole series of follow through systemic challenges, particularly around the economy and particularly around how this moves from the rich world through the developing world, and how we try and figure out how to reinvent the whole rules of economic policy without a roadmap, which it's going to take us several years, I think, to figure out at least.
Yeah, I mean, would more social entrepreneurs around Obama would have helped? Yeah, I have a lot of belief in social entrepreneurs, so I think, yeah, it probably would have. Would more social entrepreneurs engaging with government help? Yes. Would more resources for social entrepreneurs and more coordination and collaboration among social entrepreneurs and donors help? Absolutely. And I think that's what Catalyst 2030 is, a great platform to push forward.
And what would you like to see Catalyst 2030 do over the next 12 months? I mean, what for you, where does it have real leverage points that it could address?
Well, first of all, I'm mostly focused on helping Catalyst 2030 attract more donors to the movement. So you have this incredible practitioner-led movement that has very, very few donors. And I think involving donors is important, not just seeing them as a cash machine, but as real participants lending their ideas and their platforms and their power and leverage to the movement and in the conversations. But of course, funding is needed too, and particularly in these early days, I think just getting donors to the table to participate in a non-financial way, but also in a financial way to help, at least initially, support funding the Secretariat, which doesn't require a lot of money, but it does require some amount of funding going forward. So just a pitch to there happen to be donors on the call or people who know donors who might be interested, please be in contact with me.
And I mean, there's a couple of questions here that relate to that point specifically. I mean, one is from Haluk Aikul, which is, if you want to change the mindset of a philanthropist to systems change, what are the major blocks you need to overcome, and what are some rewards you may use to incentivize them other than the system change itself? And then from Bridge Qatari, is there a belief deficit currently between donors and doers? Do donors really have deep confidence in doers to be able to bring about systems change? Is it more than theoretical, this belief that social entrepreneurs can deliver?
Well, so on the belief point first, I do think that there is a belief deficit, and I think part of that's an awareness deficit, which is, that is, if I think more donors had had the opportunity that I've been privileged to have as a member of a social entrepreneur community to see what other social entrepreneurs are doing, that we could address that first awareness deficit and then belief deficit. And again, I don't want to point to Catalyst 2030 as being a silver bullet to solving all these problems, but it certainly can help facilitate that by bringing more donors and doers in closer proximity to each other. In terms of how do we change donors' belief, I don't think that funding systems change, quite frankly, is for every donor. That may be a bit controversial. But what I do think every donor ought to be doing is embracing a systems mindset. So, and I think those two things are a bit different. And I think embracing a systems mindset gets you to think about what you're doing right now. How is that part of a broader system? And I think if we can get more donors embracing a systems mindset, more will get to the point where they're actually also supporting systems change. But I think it's probably a gradual process. I mean, if we look at ourselves as individuals and as organizations, where transformational change doesn't happen quickly. One has to often do it gradually. But I think there's lots of opportunity to do that.
I mean, your donor, Richard Chandler, is part of the Giving Pledge, which, marks its 10th anniversary next month, I think. I mean, is that a group of donors where, this is on the table, that people like Richard or others would be talking about systems change and trying to encourage the others to do that? And do you think there's the potential for more? Co-Impact obviously has been launched separately to the Giving Pledge, although clearly Olivia Leland, who runs Co-Impact, was part of the Giving Pledge launch team. So there's some overlap. But I mean, is this something that is, you're sensing a bunch of donors are now trying to take more seriously?
Yeah, so I think it's important to recognize that the Giving Pledge was started to get commitments to give more. It wasn't about making commitments to give differently or more quickly. Although there were discussions at the beginning to also include those commitments. So it's been about commitments about giving how much, what proportion of one's wealth. And that's been the large focus. I have seen a growing awareness within the Giving Pledge to think about different ways of giving, and giving that will, I think, be more high impact. It has to be done from existing pledgers, kind of to support that. We had at the School World Forum, we had a virtual session where we had the current lead of the Giving Pledge talk a bit about that, Sophia, and she was seeing some promising signs. So I think that could be a great platform for growing awareness and from using peer-to-peer influence among donors.
So there's a question from Steve Podmore. When people talk of wanting to support systems change, most of the time they're not remotely interested, or they don't have the resources to analyze, assess, or look for proposals that do exist, because systems change does include complexity, and complexity is rarely simplified effectively or communicated relentlessly. And so he's saying there's a matching challenge. Do you agree? And how do you, Tim, approach big, bold ideas and proposals? So there's a few tips for the community here if they do have a big, bold proposal that they want to bring your way.
Yeah, it's so. Do I agree? I think yes. It is. Every donor, no matter how much resources they have, those resources can't are still limited in terms of the complexity and the size of the world's problems. So um, to say that we fund systems change, you really have to narrow it down into what systems and what issues are you focusing on. So in terms of what Chandler Foundation is really, our focus is around how do we engage with governments to improve governance, particularly around things like transparency and accountability, around evidence-informed policy making. We think of, well, our donor likes to think of what is possible and think about what is your preferred future once this system change is over. Write that headline, write that story, and what is your vision for that and how will you get there, and what other actors does it involve. So I don't know if that's helpful in terms of at least the way we think about it, but we also think that almost always has to involve a coalition of actors. It has to involve, how do you think about it, engaging governments in the process? Because so often I think social change actors have or seen government as the problem, and so ignoring them, setting up a parallel system, or maybe opposing them in a way that is not as effective as it could be. So our approach, and it's not the only approach that can be taken, but it's the one that we've chosen to take, is to look for actors who want to work more at working in collaboration, more an inside-out model with government than an outside agitation, putting pressure on government, which is very much needed. I don't want to downplay the importance of those efforts, but it's not the type of thing that we typically support.
And it's interesting because I guess Nancy Chan makes this point that policy change and advocacy is very hard to measure and attribute outcomes to a specific donor, which I think is again comes to one of these challenges as to why donors don't do some things. But it does seem to me that has been a way that you've seen a handful of really smart philanthropists, and actually unfortunately many of them on the right, who have used advocacy and more political strategies to achieve their ends. And I guess on the more progressive wing, George Soros has been very effective in that space. But it still seems to be seen as something that most mainstream foundations don't want to do a lot of. Do you think that needs to change if we're serious about systems change?
I do. I do think it needs to change. I think working in around advocacy, around policy change, where it's one can't guarantee results. So that's another thing about so many of these kind of big systems change efforts. You can't. It's difficult as a social change actor to tell a funder, I know we will achieve this. I can have confidence, because you don't know. When you're trying to influence other actors to make changes, it's different than making widgets where you can say it's under our control and we can do it. So yeah, it is maybe more risky. It's more long term. You're swinging for the fences, just to use a baseball analogy. So you're going to strike out sometimes, and you have to be comfortable with that, striking out. But when you do connect, you can really make big change.
I know you wanted to ask me a question, so
I did.
Let's just throw it back to you for a moment.
Because I've been thinking about, and I think it's now 12 years ago when you you and your co-author, at least for me, coined what was a new term around philanthrocapitalism, a new generation of ultra high net worth philanthropists who are seeking to change the world through this new types of philanthropy. And you were generally, as I recall the book, positive and optimistic about that movement. And more recently, there's been big philanthropy has been subject to some high profile and hard hitting critiques. So how do you assess that philanthrocapitalism movement today, now 12 years later?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. Actually, one I'm currently working on a new book to try and make sense of some of that. Although I think the book, like Catalyst 2030, has also been, having to be reframed in terms of the response, the change that's going on and going to happen as a result of COVID-19, which is just so fundamental and has the potential to, both positively and negatively dramatically alter how philanthropy and philanthropists are, and non-philanthropist wealthy people are viewed. So I think we're at this is a once in a lifetime, once in a generation moment that we're in the early phases of. So all these questions, to some extent, are going to have to be reevaluated again over the coming months and years. I mean, the argument at heart that we made, that Michael Green and I made in Philanthrocapitalism was, that governments can't solve all the big social problems on their own. That seems to be irrefutable. And that there was this new generation of people who'd made a lot of money in the entrepreneurial sectors mostly, who were turning to philanthropy. And it was asking, when you get the richest businessmen in the world, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, standing on stage saying they're going to give away most of their money to try and solve the hardest problems of poverty in the world, are they serious? How are they going to do it? Are they a completely random fluke, a blip, or are they part of a broader movement? And how would they actually go about solving some of these big challenges? And so we looked at that in the book and really concluded that while a lot of philanthropy wasn't very effective, it does have the potential, even though it's small relative to the amount of money that governments could deploy, there is the potential there to be the smart capital backing the out of the box thinkers, the longer term projects, the catalytic projects that can really have an exponentially large impact. So there was a sort of theoretical enthusiasm for the ability of these philanthropists to solve some or help solve some big problems. I think as I reflect on the reality of it, and I think this was what some of these books have picked up on, I mean, clearly, there has been a shift of many more wealthy people, and many more of those people saying they're committed to philanthropy, so by signing the Giving Pledge, for example. But it's clear that the amount of money that they've moved into philanthropy and the effectiveness with which they've been deploying it has lagged, to say the least, well behind the talk about it. And so it's no surprise that there's been a lot of criticism, particularly given the broader trends in inequality of which they've been beneficiaries or drivers. So but there have been, I think where the criticisms have been unfair has been that there have been some exceptions, notable exceptions. And, I think that none of the books have really, to my mind, for example, done a terribly good job on either Bill Gates or Jeff Skoll or Pierre Omidyar and a number of others, George Soros. There's a bunch of case studies which I would have liked to have seen really reported thoroughly to look at, what can you learn from them, both positively and negatively, about what works. And that's part of what I want to do with this new book. But obviously now, we're seeing Gates particularly step up in a fascinating way and, be leading not just in the developing world, but really the whole effort globally around trying to find a vaccine for COVID. And we are now going to find out whether there's the kind of response to Catalyst 2030 initiative and to other big, bold ideas. Will philanthropists say, this is our moment, we can redeem ourselves here and actually show that we're serious about making a big contribution? and to hear some of them talk, they're serious about that. But I think one of the things that we've talked about that I think is sadly missing is there's not a very good feedback loop. There's not a good learning system in philanthropy, and philanthropists can surround themselves by people who just say what a tremendous job they're doing, even when they're not. And it's very hard for people who have got good ideas, social entrepreneurs and others, to penetrate that bubble and to get good ideas funded to scale in a way that if you're a private company with a hot startup in Silicon Valley, you can get funded to scale quite quickly. There's something about the dynamics of this whole philanthropy ecosystem that aren't working properly, and we really need to have an honest debate about how we fix that. We tried to do some of that debate in philanthropy capitalism, actually, and so some of the issues that the critics have been bringing out before the crisis, we actually raised also in philanthropy capitalism, and not much was done, which was a great disappointment. I don't know that. How do you react to that assessment?
Well, in terms of the dysfunctional feedback loops, yeah, I was. I agree. I mean, I was quite aware of them on the doer side, and as someone raising funds. And I just think it's largely due to the differing power dynamics. It often results in a lack of frankness, transparency, and a loss of learning, and a loss of real, true, more effective partnerships. So I'm not sure exactly how to address that. I'm just a year and a half onto being in the donor side. I've gotten some new insights, but I do think, again, coming back to Catalyst 2030, that Catalyst 2030, creating platforms or spaces where there is that shift the power dynamics a bit and are more safe spaces for frank conversations. And there are other ways of doing it other than Catalyst 2030, but Catalyst 2030 has some advantages there, and it's at a practitioner-led movement. So it's a collective right now of mostly practitioners, so they can speak with a more collective voice, and often that's easier to be more bold and frank, and also you're gathering from more data points, so it hopefully has more validity. But we'll only get that if we get more donors into Catalyst 2030. So it brings me back to my pitch.
Yeah, and I think there's clearly, a power dynamic issue that it is very hard when you are asking for money to really be candid with someone that has the money to give to you. And I wonder whether that could be one of the things that this group is able to do, is to sort of collectively say, well, here are some of the changes we would like to see in the grant making process, for example, that would have that imprimatur of being a practitioner-led movement. I mean, I don't know whether do you think that exercise of collective action would be helpful?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think there are other foundations and donors are doing also good things that are moving towards that. I mean, you see much more in the way of kind of anonymous grantee feedback to donors, things that the Center for Effective Philanthropy has done, and others, this trust-based philanthropy movement. Yeah, but I don't know that we'll ever get the power dynamics to a place where it's ideal, but it certainly can be improved. So almost any efforts to change that power dynamic, to change transparency and frankness. And again, Catalyst 2030 is a broad movement, but it has people. I mean, you asked specifically about Giroux. So Giroux is one of those people who's willing to be frank. And there are many others within Catalyst 2030 leaders. And I think when you're already a world-class award-winning social entrepreneur, as so many of these members of Catalyst 2030 are, you have more credibility and more platform to do it, and that's enhanced when it's a collective platform.
An interesting question here from Diana Wells of Ashoka. My experience is that 2008-9 marked a period where philanthropy became more short-term and restricted and less flexible. I've been heartened to see the response to this crisis has been different, at least in rhetoric, and a bit in practice. Am I right to be cautiously optimistic that this is a reverse of a starvation cycle for non-profits? Please say yes, Tim, but
Yeah.
what do you really think?
Well, I certainly hope so. I'm an optimist by nature, and I hope so. But I also may be, you know, in surrounding myself with like-minded people who are both believing that and taking steps towards it. But I mean, so I don't have a full picture of whether it is. But I hope so, and I think we all need to. But it won't happen automatically. I think the default is much more likely to be, it'll be short term and fall back on those types of more typical instinctive responses of philanthropy to be short term.
I mean, do you think that when, I mean, in the way that Co-Impact is bringing donors together in collaboratives, I mean, would it be helpful to have more social entrepreneur collaboratives that are coming together as a group to say, you know, we're all focused on this particular issue here, we've got a joint plan here that we want to fund at a much larger scale than, have funded at a much larger scale than we normally see?
Well, I think creating platforms that make it easier for social entrepreneurs to collaborate and coordinate is important. I mean, that's distinct from funders who, often with good intentions, create forcing mechanisms for it to be done when it's not, doesn't make sense maybe, or it's not organically led. So one has to be mindful of donors who say, yeah, we need more collaboration, so I will fund a collaboration if to, you know, under these circumstances. And I've seen, and I'm sure many on the call have seen, such actions which lead to less than effective collaborations.
So I have a couple of last questions for you. You may have another question for me, but I mean, I'm going to finish because time is running out by asking you really where you'd like to see Catalyst 2030 in a year's time, and you know, any particular challenge you may have to this group here as to one thing that you'd love to see from them. But you may have a question for me before we wrap up.
Can I ask my question first?
Sure. Play for time.
Yeah, no, just it is about well, maybe I'm asking you the same question, but I won't put it in terms of Catalyst 2030. What would philanthropy look like if it were to do the right thing, say in 5 years' time? What would we see more of? What would we see less of?
That is a great question. I mean, I do think that a lot more investing in an ecosystem that actually promotes transparency about what's working and what isn't working, and gets a real conversation going, where so that we would be able to say with some confidence, you know, this foundation's really quite a smart investor that's really having a big impact, and this one has been all over the place. It seems to change its mind every 6 months. It's you know, it doesn't seem to have any real sense of commitment to its don't. So, and at the moment there's no easy source to go to even for that information. But I think if you started to lead the donor away from being judged on the, you know, professed size of their check to some sort of sense of the impact that they had, that would be, I think, a big shift. I also I do think that the issue of inequality and this particular debate around not paying taxes, you know, is one that they need a better answer to. You know, we in philanthropic capitalism, we had this idea for, we said what would go into our good billionaire guide, and the basic premises were, you know, you would earn your money in a way that was legitimate, non-exploitative, and that itself turns out to be a much harder question to answer than it felt 12 years ago, when companies like Google and Facebook, seem to be much more exploitative today than they did back then. Secondly, that you would pay a higher rate of tax than people on lower incomes. Again, that doesn't seem to be happening at the moment. But then you would do, massive amounts of philanthropy, and you would commit to doing that in a way that is effective and impactful. So those were the four components of what we thought would be a necessary part of, a new social contract between the rich and the rest. But I think, whether there's time for whether it's too late for that kind of, sort of social contract, or whether we're going now into sort of all-out war against the billionaires from the political class and so forth, that's going to be a very interesting dynamic. And as I say, this moment of COVID, particularly because Bill Gates and Jeff Scott have been so ahead of the game on pandemics and public health responses, there may be this moment where there's a last chance for the super rich philanthropist capitalists to really show whose side they're on, and that they're on the side of the broader public. Otherwise, I think we may be moving into a bit of a battleground where it becomes harder and harder for philanthropists to play the role they could be playing in society. Now, what would you like?
So just +1 on that. I also think that donors need to treat program partners more as partners and less as subcontractors or contractors to we as the donors have a vision of what's needed. Now we just got to go around and find people to hire as contractors to do that. And the donors ought to be going around looking to see who has been effective already. Do your due diligence up front to make sure that these social entrepreneurs and our coalitions and organizations have been effective, and then get out of their, fund them, and not totally get out of their way, be a partner with them, but as a really a true partner in co-creating and recognizing particularly that if they're dealing with a social problem that really is big enough to be worth addressing, it's going to be complex, and the approach to solving it has to be iterative. And so to create any short-term plan, but let alone a long-term plan that's very specific, and you're going to follow the plan along the way, it's going to need to change. You're going to have to be iterative, and you're going to have to provide more flexibility to donors. Why aren't donors funding? We have these commitments around COVID, in the COVID era, about being more flexible, being less restrictive. Why can't that be the norm? Not just in a time of crisis, but always. I think this is a moment when things can change, but I think we can't just relax. We have to lean into that moment and make these changes stick.
And so finally, in wrapping up, do you have, you're a great fan of Catalyst 2030, catalyzing change. What's the one thing you'd really like to see from this group? What's the challenge you have for them to really take it to the next level?
Well, again, in the short term, it is getting more donors to the table, and those donors providing some funding so that we can get that secretariat funded. In the longer term, it's about building bridges between donors and doers and creating more trust-filled and trust-based and values-based partnerships, not just transactionally between one donor and one doer, but across those sectors. I think both have a lot to learn from each other. Maybe it's because I spent much more time on the doer side that I feel like the donor side has more to learn from the doer side, but there is cross learning and more creation and true partnership, and that's trust based, values based, and has a more equal power dynamic.
Great. Well, I hope that we can create the safe space here that those kind of partnerships how to do them can be explored. So thanks, Tim, for giving us this time. I must apologise for those who put questions down that we didn't get to, but I think we've covered the broad themes that are being addressed in the questions. And I thank everyone for joining us today, and hope you found the conversation stimulating. And Tim, I hope we can, I know Jeru asked me to say this, that this set of conference of Zoom calls has been an experiment, and we hope to return and do more in the future. We hope you'll come back and maybe we can continue the conversation again in the future.
Would love to, and thanks Matthew and Jeru and the whole Catalyst 2030 team. I think this has been a great experience, and let's meet the power and potential in this movement.
Amen to that. So goodbye everyone, thank you very much.
All right, thank you, bye everyone.